Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 12 draft wildcard video. And obviously I've already plugged in my wildcard, but the idea behind the Game Week 12 wildcard is forecasting what the best sort of team is right now at this stage, looking towards one of the big fixtures in terms of blank Game Week 18 and also potentially double Game Week 20. Now we haven't had any information yet that double Game Week 20, or at least the double Game Week that we expect, is confirmed. But we do know that that is still a very likely fixture possibility, and hopefully we'll get some news over the international break confirming that over the next 2 weeks. Now, I don't think whether that fixture getting confirmed changes the draft a lot, so do look at this draft as a sort of template, but it might change, of course, a little bit if we get confirmation that Game Week 20 is to come as a double game week. Now, what I would like to say with the wild card is you're looking at a window here once again where there are a couple alternatives in terms of some of the picks, and I do think that there is also almost an option A and an option B, and we'll discuss that later on in the video. I think within the defender positions, once again, my opinion is still the same, where Trippier is now sort of entering a bad run of fixtures. We could revisit Trippier later in the future, but there's no need to really jump into Trippier right now. I think this is the time to just spend as much money as possible into your attacking positions. Know that you'll have to book some transfers because of AFCON and the Asia Cup, and understand that probably your defense can be as light as possible. Now, there will be some defenders at that sort of 5.x million price bracket, and I'll talk about them in a second. But just to sort of touch on AFCON and Asia Cup, one thing that's worth reminding is that Salah, Son, and Mbumo will all be off around that sort of time window, because the AFCON, obviously the African Cup of Nations, will be happening at around the same time the Asian Cup is happening. And so that means that Son will probably be out of FPL for a while, Salah as well as Brian Mbumo. So when you go into a wildcard draft, it's worth recognizing that actually in around, let's say, 8 or so game weeks, you have to be thinking about exit plans away from Salah, exit plans away from Mbumo, as well as exit plans away from Son, which I think it's a little bit easier if you probably own 2 out of 3 of those players as opposed to owning 3 out of 3. But that's sort of one thing that I have to warn everyone about. And then obviously in terms of blank gaming 18, it makes more sense to probably invest into the defenders or the goalkeepers, right, from a team like Brentford or a team like City, because obviously the issue with Game Week 18 is a lot of those times where we own Haaland in a 3-5-2 structure, you're forced to actually play potentially, let's say, Archer plus another player in that week. And that's not actually so bad, because of course Archer seems to be one of the few competent strikers within the Sheffield United team. But of course you need to understand your team's a bit weaker, but so will the rest of the field, right? Everyone's going to have a slightly weak team then. But you can actually continue to sort of bench players like maybe Pinnock, like maybe, let's say, Walker or Ruben Diaz, and then also have a keeper from Brentford or City that can be benched on that fixture alone. And that will probably still make you extremely well set up for a potential double game week 20. So that's the first thing I want to say. And that's why in the defense for this team, I do think that Walker is a pick that I would suggest. However, I can understand some people have some, lack of want to go into City defense, because City obviously as a team are the best defense, right? We say that because their underlying stats are the best for defense, but obviously I recognize last season clean sheets, that belonged to Man United. But obviously if you look even further back, years past, a team like City, of course, were still leading the league in clean sheets. I think right now, based on what we've seen so far in the league this season, Walker's minutes in the City team have completely upgraded to a new level, and that new contract might have had something to do with it. But the reality right now is that Walker basically is the undisputed starter for this team. And actually, in the past, I used to say Ruben Diaz was the most nailed City player, but actually, we've also seen Pep in some press conferences talk about how Ruben Diaz might be capable of getting rested. And in some games, he's not actually as dominant on the ball as he is. For example, he is not a John Stones in terms of how he progresses the ball at times. And sometimes, actually, we've seen Ruben Diaz get benched. After the previous international break was a good example of that. So I do think Walker right now is the pick to go with. And that's why I think Walker can be debatable, right? If you don't want to go into Walker, I think there are 2 other picks right now that are acceptable, right? And that's going to be James, Reece James, that is, who's obviously recovering slowly, right? Chelsea are easing him in. He's played 65 minutes in the last 2 matches. However, he has started and he has broken that 60-minute barrier. So if you have any faith whatsoever in Reece James and you really want to tap into the upside of potentially what could be the best attacking fullback in the league outside of Trippier and Trent, then of course Reece James can be sitting on your team as a bench option ready to go for, let's say, Game Week 14 or Game Week 16 and beyond. So I think Reece James is another option too. And the other alternative option is Pedro Porro. Now, why I suggest Pedro Porro as an alternate is because he himself doesn't have blank game week 18, right? So Walker, for example, if you invest into Walker, you'll also know that maybe your team's going to be a little bit weaker in 18. But I think if you can accept that fact and just know that Walker has good games leading on to 18 and after 18, he's quite an easy hold in your team and probably the pick that I would go with. But at the same time, if you don't want to deal with City at all, and you want to cut down on as many of the blank game week players as possible, then I think Porro is a great alternative. The issue with Porro, of course, is what we know. Van de Ven is injured and out for a while, potentially out until January, and obviously Romero is still out for the short term. So even if, for example, let's say game week 13, he's got an okay fixture, maybe you don't actually buy into the fact that Porro is very good on game week 13, because even though he's facing Aston Villa at home, Aston Villa, of course, have still been an incredible attack for the time being. And actually, if anything, our estimations on Brighton as a team, seeing them as a top 5 attack, but actually a mid-table defense, I actually think that we can ascribe that to Aston Villa now. Aston Villa are now that sort of team where their underlying stats suggest they're comfortably in that top 5, whereas Brighton have actually fallen down in terms of attack in recent weeks. And part of that too is because they have struggled with managing Europe and the injuries that they have. So I do think Aston Villa, of course, is a team to fear. If you want Porro, though, he's an option and he's an alternative. So that's one thing I want to talk about in terms of defense. Now, in terms of alternative options as well, I think there are 2 pairs, and I'll talk about those 2 pairs when I go through option A and option B of my wildcard drafts. But I think the locked-in players are pretty clear. It's going to be Haaland and Salah, and even Mbeumo as well. I think you can lock these players in. You can also even lock in someone like Flecken as a goalkeeper, just because I would have the confidence that he will be that goalkeeper in that double game week if it actually happens. And I do think that we should still believe that there's a strong likelihood that it will happen. But let's just quickly go on to the team. Before we jump onto the team selection, I would really like to shout out the 50% of viewers who are currently subscribed. 50%, unfortunately, are also unsubscribed. So if you guys can help me make that push towards 20K before the end of this year, I would absolutely love that. That's what we're trying to do with the channel, try to make it grow so that we can continue to make videos. If you guys can get us to 20K, like the video, comment, whatever you can to help the algorithm, I would really appreciate that. As far as the team, I'll be fielding Flecken and Areola as my keepers. Areola just because he's a starting keeper. We've lost Turner, unfortunately, as a starting keeper at that sort of price. Now he's being replaced by Vlachodimos, of course, the previous Benfica keeper, and now the Nottingham Forest starting keeper. I don't think we should really buy into him. He's still 4.5, quite a ridiculous price. The next best starting goalkeeper is 4.4, Jordan Pickford, who unfortunately still doesn't have good fixtures. As far as Flecken, as I said, the whole point here is you're investing into that double game week on the off chance that it happens. And I'm still right now, based on fixture planners and what they expect, it still seems like that double game week is going to happen. And even if it doesn't happen necessarily on 20, it's still going to happen rather soon. So it does make sense because we're probably going to hold our second wild card all the way until that 4th quarter of the season. So not only just game week 20 around that territory, but rather, let's say, game week 30 and beyond. That's maybe when we'll be exercising a wild card, maybe game week 29, something like that. So I do think you need to think ahead in terms of planning ahead, and Flecken still sort of achieves that goal. Areola also has good fixtures. He also has a good fixture on game week 18, and that's one of the key things there too. As far as moving on towards the defense, I think right now it makes sense to go with Saliba and Gabriel. I think Saliba is an absolute lock on the wild card and basically a non-negotiable. What we've seen so far is that this Arsenal team, in my opinion, the most nailed player is Saliba. The other players can actually be maybe chop and changed, right? We've seen Zinchenko play games. It's more than likely when Zinchenko plays weaker teams that he's going to be used on the ball. Whereas when Arsenal face tougher defenses and opponents, of course, with stronger attacks, you're most likely going to see someone like Tomiyasu come in, who might be a little bit better as a one-on-one defender compared to Zinchenko. On the other hand, we've also seen Tomiyasu, who basically is the Swiss Army knife of that defense, play in the right-back position. Last season, when Ben White had some pretty poor games, for example, versus Marcus Rashford, we saw Tomiyasu come in and sort of depose him for that Man City game, the first fixture where he made a huge mistake to KDB. But also, that can continue to happen this season too, right? We've seen it when Ben White is out of the squad, which is what happened last week on game week 12. We saw, for example, Tomiyasu come into the team and he can deputize at the right back position. With Gabriel, we've seen him get rested and he's going off to another international break, which is going to be tough, right? Because Arteta pretty much, if you believe that he had to manage his minutes because Gabriel unfortunately has been going out to international duty, we know that South American international duty makes it a bit more rigorous, particularly for players coming back in terms of their recovery windows and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, I still think Gabriel is the second best value option, and I do think that he'll play more games than Zinchenko. And for that reason, I still think that Gabriel is the pick to go with if you want to go double Arsenal defense. And a lot of people will be asking why go into Arsenal defense. Ultimately, I still think that defensively, we've seen them actually take a step up this season with Declan Rice, and I do think that that's a huge part. With Walker, As I said, I've explained in the earlier section why I've gone with Walker here. For me, he makes the most sense, the most nailed City player. Also actually improved in terms of underlying stats this season, given the fact that he's sort of playing this right wing position right now. He is the player who at times is holding with for the City team, and we have actually seen that Walker has stepped up both on an international level, but specifically on a domestic level in terms of his open play creativity, and the expected assists per 90 bear out to that. He has actually generally improved in that this season. I say Colwell is because Chelsea will get good games soon. You probably only need 4 defenders to see out this run of tough fixtures, which is honestly pretty poor for all defenders, right? Even if you look at a team like Newcastle, which we haven't actually included here, the reality is Newcastle have tough fixtures. We talked about that a few weeks ago when I jumped out a Trippier on my own team, but the reality is their good fixtures, unfortunately, are away from home, and their bad fixtures are at home. So those are my thoughts. And the issue right now with Lascelles is we actually got news earlier this week that Botman has been running on grass, and we don't know exactly what's going to change. I do think that, let's say, if we got 100% confirmation that Botman suddenly has had a setback and he needs surgery, then I think you can just take Colwell out of this team and replace him with Lascelles in the future. But I'm taking the information that the Botman running on grass is going to be positive for Botman's sort of injury recovery, and that Botman might be close to the team soon. Why we want Lascelles is Lascelles for Gameweek 18 and those easy fixtures for Newcastle 17 plus. But if he's not going to be back in the team and Botman, for example, is going to come back instead, then I don't think Lascelles has any value in a wildcard draft. On the other hand, you can probably just go for what should be a Chelsea starter in Colwell, although keep in mind, of course, that he himself has a small little asterisk because he's also dealing with an injury. Tsimikas, we have dealt with, unfortunately, last week where I thought he was going to be benched, but Joe Gomez had an undisclosed injury. I still think it's worth sort of playing that sort of gambling game with Tsimikas as your 5th defender, right? As your 5th defender, you're hoping that he starts on some of those games, and hopefully we can get some of these starts in the short term because Liverpool still have really good fixtures after Game Week 13, and Tsimikas is still at a ridiculous value. So I do think Tsimikas is worth punting on. And then in terms of the midfield position, this is where we have option A, and option A for me is my preferred draft right now, for the reason why I said that Son unfortunately has to go to the Asian Cup, and it makes sense to sort of book less transfers in advance, even though it's so far away. So I'm going to have Bowen here in place of Son. And then actually the non-negotiables are here as well in terms of Salah and Mbeumo. Obviously, we mentioned that they too will be leaving around that time of year, but it's not really much of an issue, right? Salah actually can be an early transfer out. I think around Game Week 18 is probably a good time that I've actually checked into fixture-wise where you can drop Salah potentially. You could probably also even consider whether you want to jump on to, let's say, someone like KDB then. Now, of course, that's going to hamper your team for Game Week 18, but saving, for example, the money to go KDB is interesting around that time. And of course, Saka, I still think makes a lot of sense right now. Unfortunately, he's still the player who gets the most minutes for Arsenal. We know that Odegaard was out due to the concussion protocol, and we know Martinelli unfortunately dealt with a small sort of injury. We don't know exactly how extensive that is on that sort of last game that they played versus Burnley. At around 89 minutes, he was subbed off. So there's a concern over Martinelli there. And ultimately, he's probably still, the most nailed on penalty taker. We know that the penalties are now shared within the team between, let's say, Odegaard and Saka primarily, but still, I still think Saka is a much clearer option than Odegaard, and so Saka stays in the team. And then Eze is, for example, that new pick. And a lot of people will be questioning, why maybe not go for Cole Palmer? And the way I see it is actually between Mbeumo and Eze, we might actually want to consider transferring out Mbeumo on blank Game Week 18. And it makes sense to do so because if Mbeumo is off to AFCON, then actually, of course, we need to book a transfer anyways. And so if you can enjoy, for example, Brentford's fixtures, like let's say, 16, 17, or even 15, for example, or even, for example, next week here in Game Week 13, then of course Mbeumo is a really good pick. And ultimately, all you need to do on Game Week 18 is actually transfer him out. So that's one thing I would consider. And Palmer will be there waiting for you at 18. He's still going to have fixtures, good fixtures then. Alternatively, of course, you can go into Palmer a bit earlier. Eze, for example, if you just see him as a short-term punt, is a very, very easy transfer into Palmer on Game Week 16. For example, you can play Eze 13, 14, 15, 3 great fixtures back-to-back for this Crystal Palace team, and then Palmer is there waiting for you on Game Week 16. So that's one option. The alternative option, of course, is you just, as I said, go Mbeumo to Palmer, just because we know that Mbeumo unfortunately will have the blank, and then obviously future blanks because he's just not going to be playing in the Premier League. And then in the front line, we have Haaland here, Darwin, and Archer. Now, a lot of people will be asking about, why the sudden change in Hart and Darwin. Now, if you've been watching my cheat sheets, you'll know that for the last 2 weeks, I've changed my opinions on Darwin. I do think he's much more nailed than he was before. And this is even after, let's say, knowing that, for example, Gakpo's in the team, Luis Diaz is also back in the team. His father's totally fine, thank God. But what the reality is now is that it seems like Darwin's minutes are very, very secure. Outside of, let's say, maybe, him dealing with fatigue, with international break issues, which is good anyways, because ultimately that fixture is City, although it's very hard to see, for example, the full strength Liverpool team not actually including, unfortunately, a fatigue prone Darwin on game week 13. So that might make it tougher for him to actually play all the fixtures between 14, 15, and 16, which are great for Liverpool. But I still think the punt is worth it with Darwin. He doesn't need necessarily to play 90 minutes to be an amazing player in FPL. In my opinion, as long as he's a starter, as long as he plays 75 to 80 minutes of football each week, I still think that Darwin is more than value for his money. And that's why I'm going to be suggesting Darwin here, alongside, of course, Erling Haaland, who honestly is, unquestionably the option to go with this week. And so for the wildcard draft, I would probably go with this as an option A structure. Now, option B is a different structure, and this is going to be Bowen out for Son, and then obviously Darwin out for Solanke. Now, what I like about this team here is you probably trade Bowen up towards Son, and a lot of people will be asking, okay, what happens to Maddison? It seems like Spurs look like a terrible team based on the Wolves game. I think let's not delve into one game sample sizes. It's worth recognizing, of course, that the main creative source for the Spurs team was Maddison. That's not even a question. But of course, I do think when you look at fixtures for Spurs, they're actually not too bad after the City game. So keeping, let's say, the 100% penalty taker of this team could be very valuable, right? We know that Son doesn't necessarily need to have an insane amount of chances to be able to convert them as one of the best finishers that we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years. So I think if you have, let's say, the confidence in Son, and some people might do, then Son actually makes a lot of sense as a hold, just because also we have a great option in the forward position at a sort of budget spot. And I think for now, you can generally consider, let's say, keeping Son. For example, he's even a great captaincy option as soon as game week 13. So Son is the alternative here. And then, of course, the alternative in the forward position is just changing up Darwin. If you don't have the confidence, for example, in Darwin's minutes, just go for someone like Dominic Solanke, right? You save a little bit more money. Here, Solanke is going to be nailed. He starts with a perfect fixture here in game week 13, and you can play him very easily here without even feeling bad about it. And that's why I would suggest Solanke and Son as an alternative option to Bowen and Darwin. Now, I do think Bowen and Darwin is probably nice because once again, you get the nailed player in Bowen and then you just punt on Darwin. I always like to punt at least one player on the draft wildcard. Personally, I think Darwin is worth the punt at this time this season. I myself am even considering Darwin for my own team in FPL. So I do think that he's a generally very valid pick right now, and I would not be concerned about owning him for the time being. And that's going to be the wildcard draft. If you guys have any thoughts in terms of the wildcard, do let me know in the comments below. And ultimately, I hope you guys have a really enjoyable international break and we can come back to more content. I am planning to release a couple more videos on top of this. One of the what we've learned updates will come out. The cheat sheet, of course, will come out eventually. Maybe I'll also even do another video series if you guys let me know any sort of differential series that you guys want to see, any sort of content that you think might be interesting over the international break. And that's going to be it for this video. So thank you guys so much for watching. And once again, thank you so much to the members of the channel for financially supporting me. And take care, and I'll see you guys next week.